helping you with real estate, Mr. Mike Johnston.
Great. So everybody, welcome to being here today. What we're going to do is we're going to go over the RE21, the real estate purchase and sale. I can provide handouts and everything that we're going through today. I'll give you a copy of. It kind of talks a little bit about what to put into different spots. If you have questions, feel free to ask the questions as well. But I'll go through a lot of this for us so that we can kind of understand it a little bit better. Okay? If you have questions, feel free to ask them. If you don't have questions, feel free to listen, and we'll make sure that things are going good. So let's go ahead and take a look first off. If you have the RE21, the purchase and sell agreement, you can see here some of the information that we're going to be filling out. Okay, so many times I'm going to just zoom in on it. If you have a copy of the RE21, great. If not, you can look at the screen and we'll have that for us as well. So let's just zoom in a little bit closer on it. Okay, on the beginning, let's just get to some of my notes I have right here so I can just make sure I'm saying the right stuff for us. Hold on for a second. On the very top of it, we have an ID number. That ID number, you can put down whatever ID number you have or that you would want to have. It doesn't really mean a whole lot. You just have to have a different number on each one of your purchase and sell agreements. Some people go ahead and just put down like the year, 2020, dash, then the month, and then the day, and then 001, because it's their first one that they've written up for the day. So it doesn't matter what you use, but you're able to do so with that. The second thing is the listing agency. Now, we have a class that we can go through and teach that talks about form simplicity, Instanet, and the MLS and other things that can automatically put some of that information into the forms if you're using form simplicity or Instanet. But we're not going to go through that today. So here, you're going to put down whoever has the property listed. You want the company name and the listing agent. Now, it says agent, it doesn't say team. It doesn't say group, so typically you're going to want to put down the listing agent, who the person is that you're going to be contacting. The office phone number, fax number, email, that type of stuff. It's not super important that you have that, but the main thing is that you have the listing agency, the listing agent. The selling agency, that would be you. Typically, you're the one that's selling this, so you put down Keller Williams Realty East Idaho. Always put down the full business name. Selling agent, put down your name as licensed with the real estate commission. Buyer. On here, you put down the buyer's names. Now, it's always this interesting thing to put down for the buyers. How do they want to have their names be shared with other people? Because sometimes these people are going to want to say, I want it to be done a certain way. Well, when you go to financing and you talk with the lender and for the title, they're going to want to make sure it's done in a specific way. Otherwise, they're going to have to fill out a form that says they're also known as. So for me, I wouldn't fill out the purchase and sell agreement as Mike Johnston. I'd fill it out as Michael James Johnston, my full legal name. So always double check that. Typically, you're going to put down legal names, full legal names for everybody on these documents. But that doesn't have to be the case, but 90-something% of the time, that's what you're going to do. Now, the next thing on here, when you put down, let's say for me, Michael James Johnston and Shannon P. Johnston, the title company likes it when you put down how they're taking title. You could put comma, husband and wife. So if they're married, you can say that to them. Or it could be two single people, whatever route that is. So there's different ways that it could be specified. Okay? So let's go back to continue on with our stuff. Okay, so we have the buyer's name. When we talk about what the property is commonly known as what? So on here, you can put down the address, 123 North Main Street, the city, the county. It says Idaho because we're only licensed to sell in Idaho, the zip code, and legally described as blank. Now with the legal description, when you put down the legal description, some people end up putting more than they need to do. or they're putting down a wrong legal description. If you're the listing agent, it's your responsibility to make sure you know what it is the seller is wanting to sell. So when you order a property profile, you'll get a packet that has the last recorded deed and other information. Sometimes when you look on the tax records, it might say 6,584 square feet of lot 2, block 1, or something like that. That's not a legal description. Why? Can you draw that out for me, that square footage that's on there? No. That's used for assessment purposes. So typically it's going to say so many square feet, not so many square feet. It's going to say the north half or the southwest quarter, something. It's going to have some other description there, a meets and bounds, or it could just be a lot and block. For some reason, you can't see that very easily. Take a look at the recorded deed, because normally on the recorded deed, it's going to say the legal description. So once you get that, you can put it down. Most of the time, we're going to find lot 2, block 3, Sonoma Ridge subdivision in Bonneville County. If it goes farther than that, like a section, township, and that, you don't need to do that, as long as it's referencing a subdivision that's already been platted. Okay? Let's continue on. So after we put down that information, let's say that you need to describe it as, because there's too much information, so you need to attach a legal description. That happens. It's not a problem at all. So on this form, as we can see here, there's a spot that talks about attaching right here an exhibit. Typically, we use Exhibit A. Now, when you order a property profile, many times they attach an Exhibit A already that is information. So when you create this particular document, you might just put Exhibit A on the top of the form, and you'd put down, you'd cut off the top and cut off the bottom, so it just shows the legal description that you received from the title company. It's always tough to try to rewrite it or to type it out, because you could make a mistake. So if you just photocopy the last recorded deed, something over the top and bottom of it, Exhibit A, the property address, and have a spot for both the buyers and sellers to sign and date it, you do it. That's what the listing agent needs to worry about. But many times we will see that because we receive a copy of it from the listing agent. If it's a long attached legal description, many times they'll put it in the MLS under the associated documents. So you can download that document and have it. Okay? Any questions up to that point? You guys are the best students ever. Okay, now let's get into the fun stuff. Number 2, on here we start to talk a little bit about the purchase price. So here we put down how much they're wanting to offer. And then there's a question here that I think is very important. On here it talks about, is this offer contingent upon the sale, refinance, or closing of another property? Yes or no. If you leave it blank, it's not applicable. But typically you're going to want to fill this out. Why? Well, if the property is contingent upon getting money from another property, because you're selling a previous house and you don't disclose that to the sellers, maybe you're saying you're able to get this financing without the sale of your home. That could be fraudulent. It could be misrepresentation. So they ask this question multiple times in different ways on the purchase and sell agreement. So let's continue. Financial terms. Note A, D, E, and F must add up to the total purchase price. So then we put down amount of earnest money. On this earnest money part, here it shows evidence by, and you select one of these. So it could be cash, personal check, cashier's check, wire transfer, note, or see section 4. Who's holding this particular earnest money? A responsible broker, closing company, see section 4. Delivered with the offer, in so many business days, 3 is left blank from acceptance, or see section 4. Positive. Upon receipt and acceptance, upon receipt regardless of acceptance, or see section 4. You have that different information that's there. So typically, when you receive earnest money, I'm going to mute people that That way it makes it a little quieter for us. So if you need to talk, make sure you unmute yourself. Okay, so with the earnest money, sometimes some offices will hold the earnest money themselves. We, for a while, were holding earnest money for a good number of years, but then we decided that it would be easier and quicker if the earnest money was already at the title company, instead of transferring it back and forth and having to verify it to say that we had it, etc. It was a lot quicker by the title company holding it. And over the years, more and more of the different real estate offices have come to realize that and have decided not to have a trust account. There's some pros and cons with that. The pros of that is it's quicker, it's already there, the title company has all the funds, they can make the disbursements. A con is if there's a dispute on the earnest money, many times the title company does not want to make the decision to release it to either the buyer or seller. So they might hold on to it, or they might want to release it back to the broker or just to get rid of it. So there's some challenges with that. But most of the time, there isn't a problem. So we're not going to talk too much about that right now. But on there, evidence by cash, personal check, cashier's check, wire transfer, or note. We many times do not, or a lot of the different places, do not want to have cash brought in. So they won't accept that. We didn't accept cash. Personal checks are accepted, but the preferred way would be to a cashier's check. That way it's certified funds, it's already ready to go, taken to the title company. So if you can recommend to your people, have them do that. Have a certified check made payable to the title company and have that be delivered. Now let's say that you mark down that it's going to be a personal check or a cashier's check and they bring in the other one. The Real Estate Commission wants you to make sure you're accounting for the money in the correct form. So you would have to have an addendum written up that specifies that it was not a cashier's check, it was actually a personal check, and have all parties acknowledge that. Same thing when it says that the earnest money is supposed to be deposited by a certain date and time. If it's not deposited by that correct time before it, you're going to have an addendum drawn up letting everybody know that it was not deposited at that point in time. Now, you could be held responsible for not notifying the other parties of that, and you might be fined by the Real Estate Commission, but at least you made the disclosure at some point in time. All right? So that's evidence by, held by, closing companies, typically the one there, delivered with the offer or within so many business days, deposited upon receipt and acceptance or upon receipt regardless of acceptance. I like to have it be deposited as soon as they get it, whether it's been accepted or not. If the people are taking it over there, great. We've had problems that they've had it be deposited at one title company, and on the counter, they changed it from company A to title company B. So the title companies would write out a check and get it sent over as long as they had authorization. So we can take care of some of those things. All right. So that would be that section. Line 23, it talks about the responsible broker. Now the responsible broker, according to the little Bible of real estate from the Real Estate Commission, it's kind of a, what is it, color this year? It's kind of a eggplant color, I don't know. But anyway, as you read that book, since it's such a good read, you'll notice certain things in there that talk about what the responsible broker does. So you can read that. But on here, when you're writing up an offer, it's going to be my name. So if you work, wherever you're working, you're going to use that broker's name. We have seen sometimes when another office writes something up and they'll put my name down and they don't even work at our office. So if that happens, I would recommend that you change it on a counter offer, because I don't want to be responsible for the things that they're doing. I might not even know the person. I know you guys and I'm getting to know you guys, so I have no problem with that. But on the other side, we don't want to have it be written down the wrong responsible broker. Then it says all cash offer, yes or no. So if you're saying yes, it's an all cash offer, let's read what it says on that particular paragraph real quick. If this is an all cash offer, do not complete sections blah, 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 blah. Fill in with 0. If a cash offer, buyer's obligation to close shall not be subject to any financial contingency. Buyer agrees to provide seller within blank 5 business days from the date of acceptance of this agreement by all parties, written confirmation of sufficient funds and/or proceeds necessary to close the transaction. Acceptable documentation includes, but is not limited to, a copy of a recent bank or financial statement. So if you're saying all cash offer, and that's what the buyers are saying, then you're not going to get a loan of any kind. Some people say, oh, I'm trying to get funds out of a home equity line on something else. Well, that's still considered financing of some sort. Or, oh, I'm going to pull it out of I'm doing a 1031 exchange. Or, oh, I'm doing this or that, proceeds coming from a bank. When in doubt, spell it out. If it's coming from some other source, make sure you put that down. And you can put that down in paragraph 4, explaining where it's coming from. Because that way, if something happens, you're protecting your buyer from losing their earnest money potentially. Because if you say it's an all cash offer and you get to closing and the people say, oh, I wasn't able to get my financing. Well, it didn't say anything about financing. So make sure you're painting the true picture of what it is. It then asks again, letter C, cash proceeds from another sale, yes or no? So it's trying to make sure that we're stating everything true and correct there. New loan proceeds, this is letter D. If a greater number than 0 appears in the preceding blank, this agreement is contingent upon buyers obtaining the following financing. And on here, you can have a first and a second loan. Why would we have more than one loan on a property? Anybody have any ideas? Some areas will have a first-time home buyer's loan, where they'll have this main loan and they'll also have a second that's helping them out with part of their down payment or closing costs or something. So there'd be 2 different loans. If you ever find out that there's more than one loan, we need to make sure that we disclose that. Why? Sometimes there's more than one loan origination fee that's going to be paid. There might be more than one other fees that are tied to it because there's multiple documents there. So make sure you take care of that or consider that when you're putting it down. Now on here, you can choose different types of financing. It shows an FHA loan, VA, conventional Idaho housing financing, rural development, or other. Now, let's say that you've talked with the lender and they're not sure if they're going to go with an FHA loan or with a conventional loan. So what would you put down on here? Radio silence. What we need to do is put down the tougher of the two. So an FHA loan would be tougher than a conventional loan. Now, why would we do that? It says in the contract, if we read through the paragraph, that the buyer can switch their types of financing as long as it does not affect or cost the seller more money. But it's always best to be talking to your lender up front. Your lender, if you've taken the time with these buyers, which we should be doing, will know what type of financing these people are going to be able to qualify for. They'll also know if there's any closing costs that need to be paid for. That way we can make sure we're doing this correctly up front versus after the fact. If you didn't go in and talk with the lender and now it says, oh, we need help with closing costs. Trying to make a change later is a little tougher to do. Okay, so we put down the type of loan, and then it says with interest rate not to exceed blank % for a period of blank years at a fixed rate or other. Now, if interest rates right now are 2.88, I typically would put something a little higher than that. I might put down 3.25. That way, in case interest rates start to go up, I'm protecting my buyer that they have a little bit of wiggle room. Because it says if they can't get the financing at that interest rate, those terms, they're not obligated to purchase it. Okay, so keep that in mind. Then it says on here, in the event the buyer is unable, after exercising good faith efforts to obtain the indicated financing, buyer's earnest money shall be returned to the buyer. Then it talks about a second loan, same type of information that's there. Then paragraph or line 40 says loan application. Buyer has applied or shall apply for the loan. And then within blank, 10 is the default. Business days of final acceptance of all parties. Buyer agrees to furnish seller a written confirmation showing lender approval of credit report, income verification, debt ratios, and evidence of sufficient funds and/or proceeds necessary to close the transaction in a manner acceptable to the sellers and subject only to satisfactory appraisal and final lender underwriting. Now, that didn't say that you could have a letter from the lender that says, oh, they're good to go, except for I need an appraisal, I still need verification of employment, I need this, I need pay stubs. That doesn't qualify for this letter. Now, not all agents out there right now are holding this paragraph to the line or to the fire when people are bringing something in. Because right now, if you have an offer and you don't have that type of a letter that says it's subject only to final lender underwriting and a satisfactory appraisal, the seller can back out. And in a market like right now where we have multiple offers that are competing, you may lose out. So make sure that you talk with your lender about getting a letter that has just those two things. And they're going to say, I need some time. Well, on here it says within how many days you're going to do it. It says within 10 business days, if that's a default. That's over 2 weeks. Okay, so you have time, but it's always best to get things started. Have your people go in and talk to the lender ahead of time so we can make sure that we can do that. Let's continue reading here. All right, it says if an appraisal is required by the lender, the property must appraise at not less than the purchase price, or the buyer's earnest money shall be returned at buyer's request, unless the seller, at the seller's sole discretion, agrees to reduce the purchase price to meet the appraised value, in which case seller shall be entitled to a copy of the appraisal and shall have 24 hours from receipt thereof to notify the buyer of a price reduction. So if we have a property and we have it written up for $305,000, the appraisal comes back at $300,000. Some people say, oh, well, the buyer's going to pay the difference. No. This right here is protecting the buyer. It has to appraise for at least the amount offered. Most of the time, that's not a problem. The problem we have is if we're offering them $300,000 for the property, and we're also asking them to pay 3% closing costs, or let's say $7,000 or something in closing costs, and it only appraises for the $300,000, not the $307,000, we have a problem. It wasn't designed originally when people started asking the sellers to pay closing costs years ago. It kind of dates me, that's why I have gray hair. But it's saying that they were originally supposed to include that or pay out of their proceeds those closing costs. But our sellers nowadays are kind of greedy. It's understandable. So many times when there's a counter coming back, they'll put down that they say that the property has to appraise for this amount, and it's including those closing costs, or they increase the price of the property to cover those. So what do we do if it doesn't appraise? Well, this right here is a clause to protect the buyer that they're not able to finance all the closing costs into it just in case it doesn't appraise for that. Now, the paragraph said the seller, at his or her option, can decide if they're going to reduce the price. If it's $5,000 that it appraised lower, they can agree to reduce the price. And if that's the case, the buyer is still obligated to purchase the property. However, if the seller doesn't want to reduce the price, then you have to renegotiate, try to get something figured out. Possibly the seller's not going to be paying closing costs anymore or something. Because we're at a standstill. The buyer's not obligated to purchase it if it doesn't appraise for at least the amount offered. So keep that in mind for you. Also, it says, buyer may also apply for a loan with different conditions and costs and close the transaction provided all other terms and conditions of this agreement are fulfilled, and the new loan does not increase the costs or requirements to the seller. And that's what I was talking about, saying if you want to put down the harsher or tougher type of financing, if you're going to select for more than one. Okay. Okay, that's loan application. FHA or VA, line 50, if applicable, it is expressly agreed that notwithstanding any other provisions of this contract, buyer shall not be obligated to complete the purchase of the property described herein, or to incur any penalty or forfeiture of earnest money deposits, or otherwise, unless the buyer has been given, in accordance with HUD, FHA, or VA requirements, a written statement by the Federal Housing Commissioner, Veterans Administration, or a direct endorsement lender stating that the setting forth the appraised value of the property of not less than the sales price as stated in the contract. And that's basically what we said. So it's protecting the borrower that it has to appraise for at least the amount offered. Now, on here, it talks a little bit about the confirmation for the letters. So up here under 3B and D, for all cash offer, it says that you'll provide information. Then under D, it talked about having that letter be written stating that you can get the financing and everything's fine. It says on here, if such written confirmation required in 3B or D is not received by the sellers within the strict time allotted, sellers may at their option cancel this agreement by notifying the buyers in writing of such cancellation within 3 business days after written confirmation was required. If the seller does not cancel within the strict time period specified as set forth herein, seller shall be deemed to have accepted such written confirmation of lender's approval, or waive the right to receive written confirmation and shall be deemed to have elected to proceed with the transaction. Seller's approval shall not be unreasonably withheld. What does that mean? Well, if you're supposed to provide a letter to the other party within so many days talking about the loan is good, the people are in good financial position, and it's not that great of a letter, and the seller doesn't come back and cancel or request something differently, then they've accepted that letter. And that's what happens in probably 99% of our cases right now. People don't know about this part of the paragraph, or they're not really worried about it. Or they say, oh, that lender's a good lender. They just need a little bit more time to get those documents. So please be careful. If you're working with the buyer, you want to do everything you can. If you're working with the seller and you have a transaction come in like this, you might want to make sure that you have a firm offer, especially if there's a backup offer or something else coming in. You might want to get rid of the first one to accept the second one. But we don't make those decisions for our sellers. We need to be able to inform them, explain to them their options. But it's always good to know those things, okay? Additional financing terms, paragraph E. This right here is if you're going to have them carry a contract, a seller carry where they're the bank, or there's other conditions you could put down under paragraph 4. Approximate funds due at closing, it's just subtracting all those numbers, the main price, subtract the earnest money, subtract all the loans, would be how much they're needing to bring in at closing, approximately. Paragraph 4, other terms and conditions. This agreement is made subject to the following special terms, considerations, and/or contingencies which must be satisfied prior to closing. On here is a spot where many times that you can, what is that? Continue. Okay, sometimes you'll have people that will need, let's say that they have a spouse that hasn't been able to see the property. In this particular paragraph, paragraph 4, they could put down that it's subject to Fred Flintstone taking a look at the property and accepting it prior to 5 p.m. on such and such a date. In this paragraph, you could put down subject to buyers receiving their funds from an IRA account by such and such a date and time. If you ever put a contingency in this particular paragraph, what we need to do is make sure that you have a time frame on there that it must be met. If you left open-ended, it says on this particular paragraph, this agreement is made subject to the following special terms, considerations, and/or contingencies which must be satisfied prior to closing. So they have until the closing date to have that done. So if you're working with the seller, you want to make sure that you have a date and time that is going to expire. Because if they say, oh yeah, we put it down for so-and-so to take a look at the property and accept it. And you guys might be okay with that. But if they don't come to take a look at it, and we're getting closer and closer to closing and they still haven't looked at it, they have a wiggle room, a little way to get out of that contract. So please counter that. Paragraph 5, it's talking about included and excluded items. Most of us that are on this call don't remember the time frame when they didn't put down ranges and ovens on here. It used to be that you always had to write that down. Here it shows that many of those are already included. So if you read through this paragraph, it shows what's included already. However, if you're going to exclude something like a range or an oven, make sure you put that down under the excluded items. Many agents will say, oh, I'm going to just put down as per the MLS. Whatever it showed on the MLS was included or excluded. That's what I want. that doesn't really qualify for us. We need to have it be specific. So when in doubt, spell it out. Write down what's going to be included, what's going to be excluded. I've seen some people, even though it says in that paragraph that the range is included, they still write it down. That's okay if you want to. You can over specify what you're including. But if there's something excluded, make sure you put that down. If you're not sure with one of the things, let's say that there's a shed in the backyard and you think it's attached to the ground. If you're not sure, write it down that that's included. An in-ground trampoline that's put there, put that down. If there's certain things in a storage room, could be shelving or something, make sure you say that that's included. Now, if you're on the listing side and you know that certain things are going to be excluded, put that down on in the listing information on the MLS so it can be excluded already. And then when it comes to an offer, make sure you look at that and explain to your seller, hey, we said we were going to exclude the washer and dryer, but here they're asking for the washer and dryer. Are you okay with that? And make sure that they're fine. The problem I've gotten from many buyers or sellers is I told my agent that we wanted this, or I told my agent that was excluded. Well, that was at the listing, let's say. And an offer can change things. Well, I told my agent I want 300,000 and all I got was 295. Well, that's because the offer came in at a different price and you agreed to it. So make sure if there's ever something that they want excluded, that you bring that up if it's being asked for. So we have additional items specifically included and excluded in the sale. Mineral rights, water rights, title conveyance. Water rights. This is a killer, and this is where people get sued a lot. So we as licensees get blamed for almost anything, even though it's not our fault, but we will be blamed. Now, if you're listing a property and there's water rights, before you mark water rights on the MLS, I'd find out what it is that you have that the seller's willing to transfer, get the information about how to transfer it, what the cost is going to be, how many shares or inches of the water or whatever it is. That way you can have that and make sure that you provide that to the potential buyers and their agent so they can verify it. They can go talk to that water resource board or to that canal company to find out about it, to make sure it's transferred. Title companies will not typically ensure that. They typically don't say that they're going to account for it or do the transfer at closing. So agents have to account for that and make sure it's brought up. Okay, now title conveyance. On here it says that the seller's going to provide this by way of a warranty deed. So that's how it's going to be transferred. Sometimes you'll get to the point where somebody says, oh, we're going to transfer it with a special warranty deed or a tax deed or something else. Unless it's been agreed to, it's going to be a warranty deed. And a warranty deed is the best way to transfer title. It's the best thing for your buyers to get. The seller's guaranteeing, warranting, stating that everything is fine and that they have actual ownership. Everybody initials and dates the bottom of that page. Top of the next page, of course, put the property address and the ID number. Continuing on with title insurance. There's different types of title insurance, and you might talk with your buyers about getting that. Now, the preliminary title commitment and CC&Rs, on here it says within so many days of final acceptance, 6 business, the seller or the buyer shall furnish to the buyer a preliminary commitment of title insurance. So they get that. And it says how many days they have to review it. So they can look at it to make sure everything's fine. So in real estate class, when we all took the classes, it talked about when you get the preliminary title report, what do? You provide a copy to your client or your customer, to the buyer. If you're working on the listing side, you're going to provide a copy of that as well to your seller. Many times the title company will have the name and email address of the people and they may do it directly, but it doesn't hurt to send it to them once you get it too, to make sure that they've got it. Why? I've seen some times when people have looked at that particular document and it shows, oh, this other parcel of land that's adjacent to it is also being transferred. And the seller says, I wasn't planning to transfer that. Or just the opposite. It's only this property and you're missing some additional land next to it that's supposed to be transferred. So always look at that, confirm it. If you're the listing agent, you need to know what it is that you're selling. Okay, skipping a little bit, going to title company. Here's where you put the title company and where they're located. Rigby, Idaho Falls, Pocatello, Blackfoot, and if there's more than one location in that community, you might put down the street address for them. Standard coverage owner's policy, extended coverage. Then we come into paragraph 10 for inspections. This right here has changed over the years, and it keeps getting modified and tweaked, and some people like it, some people don't. But the simplest thing to keep in mind is a buyer can back out for almost any reason during that time frame. I don't like the way the sun sets over the property. I don't like the way that it takes an hour and a half for my kids to be picked up by the school bus to get them to school. I don't like the way that the sun is on the property because it means I'm going to have to do more snow shoveling because it's facing the wrong direction. Feng shui, I've walked in the house and it just doesn't feel right. It can be for almost anything. So when you're having this time frame for their inspections, whether it's a professional inspection, which is highly encouraged, or they just do it themselves, the shorter time frame is better for you if you're the listing agent. On the buying side, a little longer time frame is better so you can make sure everything's fine. Okay, so the default on here says it's going to be, for the primary inspection down here a little bit lower on, it says 5 days for the time frame, 5 business days. That's normally adequate, but if they're going to have a professional inspector do it, I like to call that inspector ahead of time and say, hey, I'm writing up an offer today. We've got a property that's this size, it's over here and such. Would you be able to get a report back to me by such and such a date? Oh, I'm a little busy. It's going to be a touch more. Add 2 days to that. Okay, then you can add 2 days. Many people are putting down 7 business days because they need a little bit more time, but you don't want to have it be too long if you don't need it. All right? So I'm going to just talk a little bit about, that's the primary inspection. Now, number 2 on here is the secondary inspection. So when we're talking about the secondary inspection on here, there might be other items that need to be taken a look at. Let's say that there's a well test or the septic needs to be inspected. It could be something else that you want to have a survey done or some other thing that's going to take longer, maybe radon testing. So you could have your primary inspection be done within a certain period of time, and then you could ask for other things to be tested or to be done with a different amount of time. So on here, that is where you put that. So under the secondary inspections, you can put down domestic well test, a septic test, survey, or other inspection. On here, you can put down the other inspection could be for, you could even have the inspection be the person coming to and take a look at the property, the other spouse if you wanted to, because here it says they have so many days to do it. So there's different things and ways that you can use this. Whatever it is that you're needing, the radon test can be on here. Now, how does this work out when you have different dates for all these things? Well, let's take a look at where it says satisfaction and removal of the contingencies. So on here, the first inspection, let's say it was within 5 business days. So within the first 5 business days, the buyers can put out an RE10, that's that inspection contingency form that we use, and could say everything's fine. Then everybody signs it, and we're good to go with that inspection. They could ask for letter B, or the second aspect on there, and say we want the seller to take care of this item or that item. Or the third thing on there could say we want to terminate this contract, because within that time frame, the buyers can terminate for an unsatisfactory inspection, and their inspection could be for any reason. So they can do that. Now let's say that they go ahead and fill out the second section that's talking about some repairs or some items that they would like to have corrected. If they put down that they want the seller to fix the leaky faucet and to repair some missing shingles on the roof, they have that, and if they submit it within the time frame to the seller has, by default, according to the contract, which can be modified, 3 days to respond. So if the seller agrees to do those 2 things, then it goes forward. If the seller tries to change it in any way, shape, or form, saying, well, we'll take care of the roof, but we don't want to do anything with the leaky faucet. Well, that's modified what the buyer asked for. So within the 3 days that buyer has given that notice to the seller and they have to respond, that buyer either has to terminate the contract within those 3 days. If they don't do anything, they're accepting the property without the seller correcting anything, or they could accept and sign that the sellers come back with the modifications. So keep that in mind. You only have that time frame. Some people felt that it goes 3 days, back and forth, kind of like a counter offer until you come to an agreement. So I'll do an RE10 for the buyer. The seller comes back with a different one. The buyers do another one, and it goes 3 days, 3 days, 3 days. No, it's 3 days once you've given that to the seller to get it resolved. So if they haven't responded to you within that 3 days, I'd fill out a termination agreement and terminate the contract. Otherwise, you're accepting the property without any of the repairs being done. So make sure you explain that to your buyers, and they choose, not us, they get to choose what they want to do. So that's the simple spot with that. Now, we can go into it more and say, okay, if the seller doesn't respond to certain things, we can go back and forth and talk about what the differences are with that. So if you have questions, please let me know, and I'll answer those for you. Talks about lead-based paint disclosure. On here, you mark whether it is or not defined as target housing. Why? If you mark that it is target housing based on the age of the property, then we're going to ask that you have that lead-based paint disclosure filled out. That's a $10,000 fine to you as an agent if it's required and you don't have it and you get audited. The EPA came to town into Pocatello and Blackfoot. They didn't come to our town, luckily, and they did fine or propose fining some people in some documents because they didn't have it. So it can happen. Has it happened in our area? Not yet. It hasn't happened to our office and the offices I've managed before for over 20-something years. So that's been a good thing, but it could. Mold disclaimer. Here it talks about mold. If there's a concern, that people can do that. However, at the contingency part is, it says upon closing, buyer acknowledges and agrees to accept full responsibility and risk for any matters that may result from mold and or other microorganisms, and to hold the seller and any broker or agent representing the seller or buyer harmless from any liability or damages, financial or otherwise, relating to such matters. So if your people want to test for mold, let them test for mold. But once it closes, it's done, unless the seller knew something and was hiding it. But other than that, it should be done. Now, I'll bring up one thing. The property disclosure form. We've had sometimes where an agent has said, oh, the seller is exempt from this, and they haven't filled out the property disclosure form being exempt. We had one agent that did that in our office and made that recommendation, and it turned out to be they were not exempt. And there was mold in the property, and there was a claim for over $75,000. We ended up paying part of that because the agent made a decision on behalf of the seller, and they were not able to make that disclosure, and it put us liable for it. So please, 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 when in doubt, let your people disclose everything that they want. Don't have your seller fill out an exempt form. Have them fill out the full form, because you are not the one to decide whether they are exempt or not. Talks about square footage verification. Believe it or not, some people are upset if they get too much square footage because they have to heat more of it. Some people would be upset if they have less square footage because they don't have as much room as they thought they had. So if they want to verify it, that's great. Now, wherever you got that information, if you're the listing agent, quote your source. This information came from the tax records. If it came from a previous listing, where did they get it from? Number 14, seller's property disclosure form. Has they received it, yes or no, prior to filling this out? So that's important to be able to know that. And then subdivision homeowners association. If there is a subdivision or homeowners association, we need to disclose that and know who's going to be paying for it. So the listing agent would put down those fees in the MLS, and when it's written up, we address that. If for some reason it gets overlooked on a counter offer, it needs to be addressed. Who's going to be paying for the transfer fees, etc. Paragraph 16, cost to be paid for by whom? There's a lot of things on here that can be covered, and we want to make sure that we cover all those different items, and things can be negotiated. Depending on the type of loan, some things are not negotiable. On a VA, there's certain fees that are required by a seller to pay. If it's cash, then everything's pretty flexible and some things are not required. So it depends. So look on here, it says appraisal fee. Over in the Boise area, many times the sellers pay for the appraisal. In our area, typically it's the buyers that are paying for that. They've selected where they're going to go and who their lender is. Not all appraisers are able to provide an appraisal to a certain mortgage company or lender. Appraisal re-inspect fee. I typically would mark that down as the seller. Why? If the property wasn't ready for the appraisal and they have to come back to check something because the seller didn't have it ready, I think the seller's responsible for that additional cost, but it's negotiable. Closing escrow fee. That is the fee charged by the title company to help the buyers and the sellers get the transaction done and closing happen. So that's typically shared equally, but it could be assigned to one party or the other. Lender document preparation or processing fee, that's typically a buyer's expense because they've chosen to get a loan on the property. Tax service fee, well, I think that that's considered a seller's expense because it's verifying that the taxes have been paid on the property. And who's supposed to pay those taxes on the property? The seller. If they're not paid for 3 years, it can be foreclosed upon by the tax entity for failure to pay taxes, and they could have a tax sale. So that's why the new lender wants that to be done to make sure that there's not going to be a problem. Flood certification or tracking fee. I typically will mark that as a seller, but it's negotiable just to find out if the property is in a flood zone or not. Lender required inspections. I typically will put down for the seller to do so. If they've agreed to an FHA loan, then they're willing to take care of certain costs that are affiliated with getting that type of a loan. Attorney contract preparation or review fee, typically that's non-applicable. Title insurance standard coverage, that's going to be the seller. Why? The seller has agreed that they're going to provide proof that they can transfer and have good title. And the only way they can do that is with a title policy. Now, our office requires all of our transactions to have title insurance. So make sure that we have that on everything, even land, even if we're dealing with a builder, all these things. Why? It protects the buyer and the seller, both, by having that. Title insurance extended policy. Well, if the buyer's chosen to have a lender, then there's an additional fee, so that's a buyer's cost. Additional title coverage, it's negotiable, of course. And if there is something that the buyer wants, great. They can talk to the title company about different options they have, an extended policy. Domestic well water potability test. Now there's two different marks on here. Who's going to pay for it and who's going to order it. If there's a well on the property, I typically will ask the seller to pay for it. Same thing with the productivity test and the septic inspection and pumping. Why? The seller knows where it's located. The seller is going to be able to make sure that everything's fine, help that person come out to the property to do the inspection, know where the hookups and things are to test it. And also having them pump it, well, it's their stuff that's in it right now, so I think they should get rid of it so the new people can have their own stuff in the septic. But that's just me. Then on here it says who's going to order it. Well, it's negotiable. I like to have the seller order it because we're asking them to pay for it. However, if you let that be there for the seller to order it and they don't order it within that time frame for your inspection because you had 10 business days to have it be inspected to know if it's going to work, it may not happen. So there's many times that you'll put down the seller to pay for it, but the buyer's going to order it. That way it can be done in time for their inspections. All right? So you can put down ordered by the buyer. Then the last one's a survey. Typically that's non-applicable. However, if you have a property and there's a dispute on the lines, or they're cutting a portion off of the property, then you could put down who's going to pay for that. I'd like to have the seller take care of it. But sometimes a buyer says, I want a survey on this property and it's not required or needed. So then the buyer could be responsible for it. Now there's lines here to add other things. I like to put down home inspection. Why? Our E&O insurance carrier says if we do 2 additional things, offer a home warranty and a home inspection on the property, then we can have a reduction in the cost of, what's that called, the deductible. It can reduce the deductible by about $2,500. So if you mark it on here, home inspection and home warranty, and you put down that they've chosen not to do it, who's going to pay for it? Not applicable. That's great. You've disclosed it. They've had the choice. Or you can put it on there and ask someone to pay for it, like the seller. Or you can put down home inspection is going to be paid for by the buyer. That way it shows on here that these things were done. If you're going to ask the seller to pay for something, we always want to know how much it's going to cost. So it could be a landmark home warranty, not to exceed $500. Payable by whom? The seller. So you can put down what type of policy you want and the total cost associated with it. Lines 276. Upon closing, seller agrees to pay blank % of the purchase price or blank number of dollars. Now keep in mind, this particular thing, it can be used for anything. So if you put down $3,000 in closing costs and there's only $1,950, the rest of that can be used for anything as long as the lender permits it. We've had some brokers and other agents that have been around for a while, kind of like me, that would say, oh, they put down $3,000 in closing costs. It's not going to be that much. So we're going to have that savings to you, the seller. No, the buyer gets to utilize all of that. So if it says $3,000 on your net sheet, put down $3,000. That's going to come out of it. Now, if for some reason they can't use it, then yes, we have a problem. But typically they can use it to either pay for a home inspection, pay for a couple service calls on the home inspection. They might actually even be able to use that money to pay for something at Home Depot that they're planning to buy, like a new dishwasher or something. So it can be used for anything as long as it's disclosed and the lender's aware of it. Then line
Mike?
2. Yes.
Just a quick question. On the lender required inspections, I believe you said seller, but that's not making sense to me.
Okay,
If they decide,
we're coming down to that part right now, because right here on line 31, it talks about that.
Okay.
So on here, it says seller agrees to pay up to blank, zero if left blank, of lender required repair costs only. So if we ask the seller up above to pay costs, here we're also stating exactly how much they're going to pay for. So if, let's say that there's a roof that we know is going to have to be replaced, we could put that number down here if we knew how much it was going to be.
Okay.
I typically will put a token amount like $300 there in case there's a pop-off valve that needs to be connected onto a water heater, or that the valve going down to the ground, or the earthquake strap, or a handrail, or there's a broken window. If you see a few little things around the house, I'd go ahead and put down the seller's responsible for the first $300 or $500 worth of stuff. If there isn't any of that cost, then they don't have to pay that. Now, this doesn't go for the home inspector, what the home inspector calls out. This is what happens when the appraiser comes out and calls for things. Okay, did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Perfect. Then paragraph 17, occupancy. Buyer does or does not intend to occupy the property. This is important for the lenders, because if they put down that it is going to be owner occupied, typically the borrower gets a better rate because they're owner occupying the property. We did see a time when somebody applied for a loan and the lender thought they were owner occupying it, but they weren't. So instead of putting like 5 or 10% down, they're now required to put 20 or more % down. So we asked this question to make sure that it's disclosed correctly. You ask it one more time. Are you guys going to live in this, or is this going to be an investment property or what? And then you can make sure that that disclosure is also made to the lender. 18, section 1031, tax deferred exchange. Here it's saying that the parties will participate in a 1031 exchange. Sometimes if you're doing this for your buyer and there's certain verbiage that needs to be there, double check that this verbiage will be sufficient for the accommodator. If it's not sufficient, you need to add that possibly under paragraph 4 or having another addendum attached to it. But right here, the parties are agreeing that we can do it. So if we need to modify it with a slightly different verbiage, we can do so. Risk of loss or neglect, paragraph 19. I've had times where I've listed a property and the sellers thought, oh, I don't need to make my house payment anymore because it's on the market. Well, if it sells pretty quick, then you don't have to worry about that because they'll prorate everything. But you don't want to ruin your credit. So still be paying your bills, your utilities, everything. They need to still do that. And most of the time we explain that to the people, but for some reason, some people don't. And if their insurance goes off the property, the risk of loss is still with that seller. If the place burns down and there's no coverage, it's not the buyer's fault. The seller needs to make sure that they maintain insurance on it, that they're taking care of it. Now, there are times when somebody wants to have early possession. They want to move in early. Technically, the insurance that the people have is not the same kind of insurance because they have homeowners insurance. They're the ones living in the home. And now they have a tenant in the home, even if it's for 2 or 3 days or whatever, before they close on the property. They're tenants. Same thing if you were to transfer it over to the new buyers and the sellers wanted to live in the property for a few days or have extra time to get out. They're now considered tenants. Their homeowner's policy doesn't cover them anymore because they don't own the home. And the new people's policy doesn't cover these people living in it because they don't have a tenant's policy. So be very cautious when that happens, that you talk to the people and have the lenders be involved, not lenders, the insurance people be involved to make sure that they can have a rider or something to make sure that there's coverage. Walkthroughs, paragraph 20. There's 2 different walkthroughs that we have. The first walkthrough is after the deadline for completing any repairs. And the second walkthrough is right before closing where they can go through and make sure everything's done in a manner that was supposed to be done. Now on that first walkthrough, they go through and take a look at the property. And if it doesn't meet their criteria, they say, hey, this doesn't work, and give that seller the chance to get that corrected. On the second walkthrough, right before closing, they go through and they're trying to make sure that nothing's substantially changed with the property. A lot of times people go through and they're trying to make sure that the people look like they're moved out enough that they're going to actually be out of the house when they close. So they go the day before or something. And it's always tough if the sellers don't look like they're going to be out in time. If it doesn't look like they're going to be out in time and have everything done, have it cleaned out and give full possession, then what I would do is I would not close. Why? Once you have somebody in that property and no one's going to be happy with the way it's cleaned if they didn't get out of the house and clean it up the right way. So it's always better to just say, okay, we're going to delay this. And then the seller typically says, well, I need to get that money so I can close on this other property. That would give them a little bit more motivation to get everything done. So it's a lot easier to do it and have it be done and not have people living in the property that aren't supposed to be. Singular and plural, if it says I and it should say we, that works. Foreclosure notice, if the property's in foreclosure, the seller has the obligation to disclose that, and there's an addendum that's filled out that talks about that. Mechanics liens, contractors, disclosure here. If there is a mechanics lien that some work's been done on the property within the past 90 days, it needs to be disclosed. And we need to make sure that we have lien waivers that are signed by those people saying that they're not going to come and hinder or cause the property to have a lien against it. So my daughter just sold their house. They had some work done. They redid the bathroom, upstairs and downstairs, and a bedroom and tons of stuff, and it looks really good. But we have a lien waiver from the person that did the work. Why? Because it was done within 90 days prior to closing. If we didn't have that lien waiver and for some reason that contractor wasn't paid, then what happens? They can put a notice on the property, not the people, on the property, because the work was done to the property. So it doesn't protect your buyers. So that's why we want to make sure that everything is taken care of beforehand. Sales price information. In Idaho code, it says that the sold price of a property is not confidential client information. So if you have a buyer that says, I don't want this to be disclosed of what I paid for it, too bad. It's going to go into the MLS. If you have a seller that says, we want to write this out, and you have an agreement that says it's going to be held, too bad. We're still going to disclose it. Why? They learned about this property through the multiple listing service, and the multiple listing service requires us to put the sales price of the properties. If we don't, we're going to lose our MLS membership. And I don't think that we're going to be able to operate very well if we lose that membership. So I'm not willing to do that. Transmission of documents. We can use faxes, etc. Has anyone used a fax lately? No? Okay. I just saw a document today. I'm reviewing 3 different books for the new agent classes, and we're going to make a decision as to what book we're going to use. And in there, they talked about eFax, and I haven't used eFax forever. Then it made me start to think that that doesn't even need to be in the books anymore because we don't use it very much. But it's still a way to communicate, so it's possible. So on here, it says if there's a problem with it not being legible, in the past, we fax it back and forth 4 or 5 times, and it gets so black or not legible or unclear that they put into the contract that if it needs to be redone, all parties will sign the original document so it's clear if somebody has a question. Wire transfer warning, just stating about not doing so. Business days, it defines. A lot of agents will call me and say, how do I count out the inspections? How do I do this or how do I do that? Well, it's very simple. If it says business days, we read this paragraph right here that defines what a business day is. A business day is herein defined as Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. in the local time zone where the subject real property is physically located. A business day shall not include any Saturday or Sunday, nor shall a business day include any legal holiday recognized by the state of Idaho as found in Idaho Code blank. If the time in which any act required under this agreement is to be performed is based upon a business day calculation, then it shall be computed by excluding the calendar day of execution and including the last business day. The first business day shall be the first business day after the date of execution. If the last day is a legal holiday, then the time for performance shall be the next subsequent business day. So if we write this up before July 4th, and July 4th is considered a holiday, it wouldn't count. But some years, July 4th isn't during the week. It could be on a Saturday. I think that was the case this year. So Idaho recognized July 3rd as a legal holiday. So then that date would not count in your business days. So if we're saying we have 3 business days from today, we don't count today as day 1. Tomorrow starts day 1. And then since it's a business day, it has to be notified by 5 p.m. on that date. So you don't get till midnight. Calendar days, you go to the end of the day. But for business days, it's 5 o'clock. So if you have a home inspection and you're supposed to respond by a certain date and time, make sure you respond by 5 p.m. on that date and time. Otherwise, you may have obligated your buyers to accept the property as is. Then it defines calendar days. Calendar day is herein defined as Monday through Sunday, midnight to midnight in the local time zone where the real property is located. A calendar day shall include any legal holiday. The time in which any act required under this agreement is to be performed shall be computed by excluding the date of execution and including the last day. So we don't count the first day like we did in the other one. We don't count it as well. So you start the very next day. Then any reference to day or days in this agreement means the same as a calendar day unless specifically enumerated as a business day. So if you write down 5 days, you want an extension for 5 days. If you don't specify business days, then it's a calendar day. Attorney's fees. If anybody has a concern or complaint, everyone takes care of their own attorney's fees. Paragraph 30, default. If the buyer defaults and doesn't complete their part of the transaction, the seller can demand the earnest money in full, or they can take them to court. If the seller defaults, the seller can take the earnest money, or take the seller or the buyer to court. Earnest money dispute inter liter. The Real Estate Commission, we're trying really hard to change this or have some other modification, because one of our concerns is if someone won't sign the release for the earnest money, there's not a law that says it has to be signed within 30 days. So if you have a seller that your buyer couldn't get the financing and you're supposed to get that back to them, and the seller just says, oh, these people really ticked me off, so I'm not going to sign this form. It doesn't say that within what time they have to sign it. So they could drag their feet just bothering the buyer from not getting their earnest money back, even though they know that it should, even though the contract says it shall go back or may or will or whatever. The title company typically will not release it without all parties to the contract signing it. So we're working on that by possibly statute, or I put together a paragraph that we may end up using to replace this, because that's what they're saying needs to be done, is to modify that. That was my cat that I happen to have that while I work from home likes to come into my office. Okay. Now I'm going to explain what an interpleader is. Most of us do not understand what an interpleader is. Let's say that we have $1,000 earnest money, and the buyer and seller can't come to an agreement as to who should get it. The buyer says that they should get it. The seller thinks that they should get it. And it's just sitting at the trust account, at the brokerage's office, or at the title company. If one party instigates or begins an interpleader, what happens is an attorney gets involved and all these costs come out of the earnest money. So let's say we have two buyers. We have an agent working with the buyer, and we have the broker. So there's 4 people right there. Then on the other side, we have 2 sellers. We have the agent and the broker. So there's a potential of 8 people or more if there's more than 2 sellers or more than 2 buyers. And each of these people gets served a packet. And in this packet, it says, tell the court why and who you think should get this earnest money. And everybody is presenting their case, all 8 of those people. The court then takes that information and makes a decision based on it. Now, it roughly costs over $100 per person that served that. So if there's 8 people, there's 800 of the 1,000 already. So now we only have $2,000 that we're dealing with that could be decided as to who gets it. If the court gives it to the buyer now has 200. If they give it to the seller has 200. If the court says we're going to split it, they each have 100. Now, what happens if there's only 500 earnest money and we still have 8 people? Whoever filed that complaint is going to pay the extra $300 in order to get this to go through, and there's nothing going to be given to anybody because there's no money. If there's 5,000 or some other number, then it makes more sense to have something like this happen. Typically, I've never had to deal with filing an interpleader because I've told the court, I've told the attorneys and the buyers and sellers that if I was holding it, I'll just hold it, and then when you guys decide, then I'll disperse it. Because 50% of $1,000 is better than 50% of $200. And many times I'll recommend to the parties, why don't you just split it? 500, 500. And sometimes that works out, sometimes it doesn't. So keep that in mind, that's an option. The people can go to small claims court if the funds are not excessive, and they can go there and try to get that resolved. They can go to court and hire attorneys and all these other things if they want to. So there's different options, but never, never, never guarantee to your buyers that they will get the money back immediately. They should get it back. I always say, hey, we still need to get the signature from the other party to release it. And sometimes they drag their feet because they're being stubborn, but it says in the contract, you should get it back. And I'll do everything that I can to help you to get that back. Counterparts. If for some reason you send a copy of this purchase and sell agreement to Mr. Buyer, and we also send it to Mrs. Buyer, and they both sign different ones, those are counterparts. We can take those 2 together as long as they're 100% the same, and they can count as a copy or as their signatures. I would recommend that we get people to sign the right document so we don't have counterparts, but we're agreeing that we can use that if necessary. Non-applicable to fine, severability. If for some reason the court says one of these paragraphs is not valid, we can take that paragraph out and all the other paragraphs in this contract would still be valid. Representation confirmation. I have a document that I will share with you if you want it. Just send me an email to johnston@kw.com and say, Mike, could you get me the flyer on that class? because it talks about each one of these situations, how to mark this. If it's listed with our office and the other side's a for sale, and it's a for sale by owner, and then we're working with the buyer and we have a buyer rep, how do you mark this? If they're both agents from our office and they're on the same team, how do you mark this? If it's two agents from our office, you don't even know who that other person is, how do you mark it? Different offices, different things. So that way you can make sure that you fill this out correctly. Okay. And if you ever have a question, you can feel free to call me. It's easy to call me, 208-234-HELP. That's my phone number. You can text me at that number, etc. But I want to help you, even if it's on the weekend or something. If I can answer the call, I'll take it. So I programmed everybody's phone numbers into my phone. So when it shows up, I know it's you. And that way I can answer if at all possible. If I'm eating dinner at night and it's an unknown number, I might not answer it. But if you're calling and I can take that call and you've got a question, I'm going to do everything possible to answer your question to help you. Okay? So keep that in mind. Closing, paragraph 36. On or before the closing date, buyer and seller shall deposit with the closing company all funds and instruments necessary to complete this transaction. Closing means the date on which all documents are either recorded or accepted by an escrow agent and the sales proceeds are available to the seller. The closing date shall be no later than blank. What if we want to close a couple days before that? Well, it says no later than. We're okay. What if we want to close a couple days after that? Well, we need to modify the contract and get an extension. So we have the date, and it says the parties agree that the closing company for this transaction shall be whom and located where. Now you can have a title company be Pioneer and the closing agency be Alliance. I wouldn't recommend it, but it's possible. But normally it's the same entity. So when you make a counter, when you change who the closing agency is, you also need to close who the title company is. So there's more than one thing that you have to change when you're countering something like that. If there's a long-term escrow involved, you specify who that is. Possession, typically you'll mark on here upon closing. However, if you wanted to be sneaky and you have closing date be on Monday and you put down possession to be 2 days later, so you put that down as on a Wednesday, then everybody's agreed to let your people get into it. Well, I'm not sure if I explained that right. Whatever way you put it down, they might have it be that your people get into it early or late, depending if those dates are different. But in all fairness to the other party, if that's the case, please explain that to them, that you wrote this up, that your buyers are going to move in 2 days early or something, if that's what you're trying to do. It's always tough if someone's living in the property. If it's vacant, that's a different story, but still we have concerns. Prorations. On here, typically you'll mark that everything's going to be prorated as of closing. However, I've seen times when people say, oh, we're letting these people stay a couple extra days or something, so the prorations will be done as of a different date. Or it's a rental unit and they want to do prorations for the full month or something instead of number of days. It can be different, but most of the time it's going to be prorated as of the date of closing. Then on here it talks about fuel in the tank. Most of the time we're not talking about cars. We're talking about the fuel in the tank for heating the house. We're finding fewer and fewer that have oil tanks, but there's several that have propane or natural gas access, normally propane. Is that going to be prorated? Yes or no? Or does the buyer get it? If you're going to have the buyer get it, make sure you put that down in the purchase and sell agreement that all the gas that's in the propane tank is going to be included in this sale, if that's the case. Assignment. This agreement and any rights or interests created herein may or may not be sold, transferred, or otherwise assigned. Assignment means, right now I've written it up in Mike and Shannon Johnston's name. And prior to closing, I'm going to assign it to Fred and Wilma Flintstone. Why would somebody want to assign it? Well, they might want to assign it if I'm buying this land for Costco, who's moving into town. They already did, and I don't want other people to know who's buying it. We've had times when a neighbor wants to buy some farmland and they know if they're the ones buying it, the seller's not going to sell it to them. So they have somebody else put it down in their name and then they transfer it prior to closing. Now, there's different ways you can do that. On here, you just mark the thing that says it may or may not be. I've had some agents write this up, and on the first paragraph, we put down the buyers, and put down Mike and Shannon Johnston and or assignees. And then they mark this that it can't be assigned, and that's a conflict. So typically you don't need to disclose it up top. You can just mark it here. Now what happens if it's not marked? In Idaho, typically you can assign your interest to somebody else unless the parties have agreed not to. Even if you've agreed not to and later on you decide that you want to and all parties agree to do it, you could do that with an addendum. But if it says that you're not going to and the parties want to stick to that, then you're not going to. Okay. Entire agreement, you have the right to read the fine print in full. 41, time is of the essence of this agreement. Authority of signatory, if you're dealing with an estate or something, or an LLC or a corporation, you're stating that you will provide proof to the title company and to others that you are able to bind or to sell things on behalf of that entity. Acceptance, here you put down the date and time of when you want to have this acceptance. Now, keep in mind, just because you put down you want a response today at 5 o'clock and you just wrote it up right now, doesn't mean that the other side is capable of doing that, or it doesn't mean that they're willing to respond. This just means that your offer is good until that date and that time. After that, if the party still wants to accept it, it needs to come back to you, and your buyers get to decide if they want to extend that time frame for acceptance on their offer. Okay, now we have more and more times people are saying we're not going to review any offers until a certain date and time. If it says it's not going to be until Monday at 5 o'clock, why are you going to write up your offer to expire today at 5 o'clock when you know they're not even going to look at it until Monday at 5 o'clock? So I'd probably explain that to my buyers and make sure that they're okay with that. And if they're fine with that, I'd put down Monday at 6 or 7, because at 5 o'clock when they present it, they might not have decided yet. Give them a little bit of time. I always like to ask the other agent, I'm writing up this offer, is it still available? Yes or no? Okay, it's available. Are they going to be able to respond if I put down tonight at 5? Oh no, they're out of town. Could you give me till tomorrow? Yeah, okay, I'll do that. That way you know what's going on. And you've explained that to your buyers and they're okay with that too. Okay, the next page, buyer signatures. If there's some addendum that you want to attach to the contract that's dealing with information from your buyers, you can add that here. If there's an exhibit or something that needs to be added, you can add that here by marking it. Here's where you also disclose that the buyer does or does not hold a real estate license, or if they are or are not related to one of the agents. We need to make sure that we make that disclosure. So if you're ever buying property for yourself, you need to disclose that you hold a license. If you're selling a property to your cousin, to somebody that's related to you, you need to disclose that too. Why? Well, some people could feel that there's some advantage that you have. Whether there's a perceived value or advantage or not, it doesn't hurt to disclose it. What are they going to do? Oh, that's nice to know that you're related to them, versus later on they find out and they know that they can sue you because you didn't make that required disclosure. So it's always best to make sure that you disclose everything that you can. Here I'd have my buyers sign, date, and time it, print their name. I don't recommend putting their address, cell phone numbers, and email addresses. Why? I don't want the buyers and sellers to be communicating, because we need to be involved and write down any changes that happen. Sometimes people will agree to something when they talk together, and if we don't write it down or make it part of the contract, we may have a problem. So we want to be involved and be there to help protect the interests of the party that we're working with. Then we have the seller signatures. They can have addendums and counter offers and their signatures there, and they can disclose whether or not they have a license or if they're related. So we're good. Now, let's say we present this offer and the seller have until 5 o'clock tonight to accept it. And it turns out to be they sign it at 6 o'clock, but they accept everything that's on there. Are your buyers obligated to that purchase and sell agreement? Yay or nay? Nope. Okay, I'm getting some people shaking their heads. Correct. So in the very bottom of this form, there is a late acceptance portion. So they did sign it, they did agree to it, but the buyer only said it was good until 5 o'clock. So it goes back to the buyer, and the buyer says, well, yeah, we'll still accept this. It was our offer. It was just an hour late. Or they can say, no, we're not going to do that because it's an hour late. We already made an offer on another property. But if they want to accept it, then they can initial on this bottom part and date it that says we've initialed this, we've given them 3 additional calendar days, or you can change it to something else on there. And then we still have a binding agreement. Now, however, I'm under the understanding that the date that was signed by the sellers up above is the date of the contract. It's just an acknowledgement put together by the buyers that they agreed to let it be a few extra days. Okay, so if you're counting home inspections and other things, you're going to go by the date both parties signed it, as long as we do have it acknowledged that they've accepted that. Now, what happens if you have a counteroffer? If you have a counteroffer, on that counteroffer, it has a whole new date and time. So we don't have to worry about the time frame on this or have the people initial this. So if there's a date and time on the new counteroffer and it's signed within that time frame, then you're okay. If it exceeds that time frame and you're not doing another counter, then you're going to either have to make a change to that and extend that time frame with an addendum, or you could cross it off and have the parties initial that. So there's other ways to do it, and that would be a counteroffer. Now, with counteroffers, keep in mind that if you have a counteroffer number 1 and then you don't agree to that, so the sellers typically would be counter 1 coming back to the buyer. They want to increase the price or do a few things. And then you don't agree to that, so you're working with your buyer and you're sending back counteroffer number 2. When you send that counteroffer back to them, it's not making changes to what the counteroffer said, which is making changes to the original purchase and sell agreement and any addendums. That counter is making changes to the original purchase and sell agreement and any previously signed addendums. So make sure that if you're doing that, everything that you want to have modified from that previous contract is included on the most recently signed counteroffer. Okay? So that's how we deal with counteroffers. Addendums. An addendum is not going to be something that you're going to say, oh, let's just go back and forth and make some changes with this and say, oh, we wanted to make this change. An addendum is something typically everybody's agreed to already. So if you're going to change the closing date, hey, it looks like we're going to need a few extra days, and everybody agrees to that, then you'd fill out an addendum stating that, and everybody would sign it. If for some reason you have an addendum that is not agreed upon or is not signed, it needs to be referenced that it's null and void. That way we know that it's not going to be signed, because typically all addendums are signed by all parties. And then with the counteroffers, it's just the last document, the last counter would be signed, because that's what's agreed upon. Okay? What if you're countering back and forth and you don't want to give that counter? You already gave it to the other party, but your buyer says we want to rescind that or take it back. Or maybe it's the seller. They've given a counter offer to you with your buyers, and they now have another offer come in and they don't want to have you accept that. Typically would first contact that other party and say, have you signed that document? If they have, then say, you better get it over to me right now, because you didn't do the signed, because there's delivery and acceptance. They've accepted it by signing it, but they haven't delivered a copy back to you. So if they've done that, that's one thing. Typically they'll say, I'm meeting up with them here in about 30 minutes. If that's the case, you can give them notice that says, my seller or my buyer, whoever, has rescinded that counteroffer that we gave to you. And that means that it's no longer null and void, that it's no longer out there. Now, how do we do that? We did it voice-wise. I'd follow it up with a text or an email, because that's written confirmation. The Real Estate Commission looks at a text where we're not binding people together to count as notification. So here you've notified the other party, and it shows the date and time that that counteroffer is rescinded and no longer will be accepted. So if they sign it really quick after that time frame, they're on notice and it doesn't count. Okay? Then you can accept that other offer. If it's been signed and you didn't receive a copy of it, there's some wiggle room and there's some argument there, because it's delivery and acceptance. So always make sure that if you have a signed purchase and sell agreement, a signed counteroffer, that you get a hold of that other party and say, I've got it signed. I'm emailing it to you. If for some reason you don't get it, call me. All right? That way they're on notice that you have a signed offer, and you're asking them to let you know if they didn't get it. Because I've had people email me an offer and they don't even call me and say, I sent you an offer. I don't know anything about it until they called me, because I'm not staring at my email looking all day long for it. Some people are. I guess I'm a little more old school, so I don't look at it as fast. But if that's the case, make sure that you contact the other party and they say they've got it to protect your party that's involved with this transaction. Okay, so that's a little bit about delivery and things. Now you have the right, if you wanted to present the offer to the seller. That hasn't happened for probably 8, 9 or so years. People, when the market gets good, many times you just write up the offer and you send it to the other party and they present it themselves. But if you're competing, maybe you want to do that. And if that's the case and you present your offer, that listing agent has the right to present a counter offer to your buyers. I don't see this happening very often. It hasn't happened very often, but if you want to do something like that, it's a possibility. Some people say, I don't know if it even got presented. Well, that's one way you can find out. You presented it yourself. But make sure that if someone asks you to do that, that you talk with the client, the person that you're working with, to see if they want to participate with that or not. Okay, so we covered the RE21. We talked about the purchase and sell agreement, all those aspects of it, addendums, counters, making sure it's late acceptance, that type of stuff. So we covered all those different little things. I didn't cover the blue brochure, but we know that that's necessary. The disclosure documents, we know that those are necessary. And if you're representing a buyer and you're going to have a buyer representation agreement, that document is required to be filled out prior to you filling out the purchase and sell agreement. It's a terrible thing when staff has to say to you, we need a copy of the buyer representation agreement, and you say, oh, I forgot to do that. That's a violation of the law. So you have to have that filled out prior to you writing up a purchase and sell agreement. And on the purchase and sell agreement, it acknowledges who's representing whom. If something's marked incorrectly, we can change that with an addendum, or it can be changed on a counter. But the representation part, if you're saying that you represent them, it has to be filled out prior to you writing up that offer. Now the blue brochure, we give a copy of that to people. If for some reason you lost it, the real estate commission is not going to kill you because it says on the purchase and sell agreement that they've received it, but we still want to have a copy of that in the file. Okay. It's been an hour and a half. Any questions anybody has on the RE21 or those type of things, I'm happy to answer those. And like I mentioned, if you want a copy of those that explains how to fill this out a little bit more, if you send me an email at Johnston, JOHNSTON @kw.com, I will reply to that email and I will attach, it'll probably be a bigger file than you want. I'll send you a copy of a lot of the forms class that I teach that counts for credit. I'll give you a copy of that form and you can see the answers, how to fill out a lot of different forms on there. Okay. It's been a pleasure spending some time with you today. And if there's any other classes that you want or any of these other things to cover, like the listing agreement, I'd be happy to cover that, how to fill out different little things. Happy to do that. So you can either let Josh know, myself know, Josie know, something like that, and then we will schedule something. I like to do it in the afternoons, so hopefully that works out good for you. We could do mornings, but a lot of times people are doing other things in the morning, so typically afternoons work out great. But whatever it is that you want to have covered, I'm more than happy to cover those. And if you have questions on documents, as your broker, I want to help you out and answer any questions that you have. Sometimes multiple people have the same question, so I'll say, hey, let's do a class on that. If it's something simple, I'll just answer your questions for sure. So please let me know if there's anything that I can do to help you out. And I've recorded this here so that we can redo it, and I'll put it on my YouTube page. And if you haven't been there, go onto my YouTube page, and there's a lot of other files and folders and things on there for classes that I've done. And I'm trying to get enough people to like me, I guess. I guess they have to subscribe or something, because then I can change the name of the YouTube channel to be something cool instead of something kind of weird. So if you go there, please subscribe, and that way I can get closer to the number of people. And then anytime I post something new, you'll know about it. Okay,